Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Prize from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And yeah, let's make welcome Medea Benjamin.
Well, it's so nice to be here. I want to make sure you can hear me okay. Is this okay? Yeah, great. So I don't know if any of you read the news in the New York Times that came out yesterday talking about how the U.S. is warming up to the idea of helping Ukraine to attack Crimea. So some of you are shaking your head, and I just bring this up in the beginning because it shows just how incredibly dangerous this conflict is and how we are walking our way into World War III and possibly a nuclear war. And I used to think we were walking our way blindly, but now I feel like we're walking our way with our eyes totally open. And that perhaps there are people in our government who are using this conflict to test out all these weapons, and they don't seem to mind that we are going deeper and deeper into this disaster. And I just feel like as I've been traveling around, it's been very hard to kind of shake people up to recognize that it's our responsibility. I mean, we can't influence Putin. He's not our leader. We don't live in Russia. If we did, maybe we would be anti-war activists there. Maybe we would be in jail there. Maybe we would have been living in exile. Who knows? But we live in this country. And it's very hard to break through the media right now. It depends what media, of course, people listen to, but if you're talking about the mainstream corporate media, you're getting a narrative that is repeated over and over again. For example, how often have you heard this conflict in terms of unprovoked and unjustified? Those adjectives are constantly being used. And I would say it's unjustified because I think war is unjustified. And I think that we have to, as a human species, find ways to live together without killing each other. But when it comes to provoked, it seems that these last couple of decades in which the U.S. has been doing things with our neighbors, our friends in NATO and Western Europe,
are you ready to war?
Aimed at the Russian territory, is totally wiped out of the picture. So that most American people are unaware or just dismiss the fact that there was an agreement made with Gorbachev at the time when the Soviet Union was breaking up, that we would not move NATO 1 inch eastward. That was an agreement. It wasn't written on paper in a treaty. But people who were involved at that time say that everybody knew what it was. And that it was accepted that that was a negotiated agreement they had, that the Soviets were going to allow for the reunification of Germany, and that the US and NATO were going to respect the security interests of the Soviet Union or Russia. And yet, today, that is so dismissed by people who are in our government, and by a lot of people in the Washington think tanks and academia. And it kind of amazes me because in the book, we have a lot of quotes, but there are so many more of them that you could use that show people who were either in officialdom, ambassadors from the United States in Russia, people in the academic community, journalists, all kinds of experts who said similar kinds of things starting in 1991 and after that. Don't cross the red line. That if we expand towards Russia's border, there is going to be a conflict. Russia is going to react. You're going to create instability in that part of Europe. It's a horrible mistake. This is not only something that Putin would say, but according to the guy who's now the head of the CIA in the United States, William Burns, when he was back in Russia at that time, he said it's widespread among Russians that is a red line. So to not recognize that we have pushed and provoked by adding more and more countries going closer and closer to Russia is to not recognize history, is to not bring the historical context into this. And then there is the issue of NATO itself, because we're constantly being told that NATO is a defensive alliance. And there are so many reasons and examples to give that NATO is not a defensive alliance. NATO is an offensive alliance. NATO is a dangerous military offensive alliance. And we see that in the NATO bombing in Kosovo. We see that in the NATO involvement in Afghanistan. We see it in the NATO involvement in overthrowing the government of Gaddafi in Libya. We see that now in NATO setting its sights not on any place that has to do with the North Atlantic, but with China. That's what NATO says is the real adversary, is now China. So NATO is a very dangerous military alliance. And if you could imagine that kind of military alliance, anti-US, and Mexico says we want to join that alliance, or Canada says we want to join that alliance, the US would never agree to that. You know, it's said that Ukraine should be able to join NATO if it wants to. Well, you know, in a world that's not a world of geopolitics, perhaps that would be the case, but you have to look at it in the geopolitical context. That large countries, like the US, like Russia, like China, believe they have their spheres of influence. Whether we like it or not, that's what they feel. And the United States has now for 200 years, it's the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine, where the US has said that we will not accept foreign hostile military in our backyard. And our backyard is not Mexico, our backyard is the whole hemisphere. So that is what has been US policy for a long time. And those of you who know some of the history know that the US has invaded and overthrown governments, of course not just in Latin America, but a lot of them in Latin America for a long time. And so there's another issue about US involvement in Ukraine that it's important to bring out, and that's the issue of what happened in 2014. And we go into this in great detail in our book, because we think it's important that people really understand the story of it. But to just summarize it now, you can think of a peaceful demonstration against a government that was democratically elected but corrupt. People didn't like the government of Viktor Yanukovych and started organizing against it. And went into the square called Maidan, and a lot of people came in, and it was a peaceful uprising that got hijacked. And it got hijacked by people with ties to neo-Nazi groups, paramilitary groups. It became a violent uprising, And while there were talks between the government of Yanukovych and the Europeans to try to come up with a solution like elections very quickly, this group said, no, we're not going to allow that peaceful way of transition. We want to see Yanukovych out right now and to put in a government that was anti-Russian and pro-Western. And there was US involvement in this as well. In the years leading up to 2014, there was a lot of US money, you know, the National Endowment of Democracy, a US government agency, our tax dollars used to build up anti-Russian groups within Ukraine. And then on top of that, we see evidence of direct involvement of the United States in trying to maneuver the uprising and trying to decide who would benefit, who would be the next leader of Ukraine. And there is this amazing telephone conversation that was leaked between the Assistant Secretary of State at the time, Victoria Nuland, and the ambassador to the United States in Ukraine, where they actually talk to each other about who they are going to put into power, who they're going to be sidelined because they're better on the outside. And this is one piece of evidence. I look forward to the day when we have a lot more of these government documents coming out so we can learn the extent of US involvement in that. But you also see physically Victoria Nuland going out to the square where people are revolting against the government and handing out sandwiches and cookies to them. And I think of January 16th last year when there was an uprising against our government. And imagine if a Russian official came out during that time and said, hey, you all are doing a great job. Here's some cookies for you, and go and overthrow your government. We laugh at that because it just wouldn't happen, because the US would never allow that to happen. But that's what happened in Ukraine. And then after that, there was a pro-Western, anti-Russian government put in place, and that's when the breakaway republics happened in the Donbas region. And that's also when Russia came in and took over Crimea. I see people leaving. Are you leaving because you don't like what I'm saying? You know, sorry. I just wanted to invite you to talk if that was the case. So the U.S., after the uprising, there was a call within both Europe and the United Nations to get involved and try to find a way to ease the conflict in the Donbas. And at that time, there were negotiations, and these negotiations led to what's called the Minsk Agreement. There was the Minsk I and the Minsk II. And that agreement brought in observers from the European organization called the OSCE, and the presence of those observers really did help to ease a lot of the fighting that was going on along the Donbas line. But what was part of the agreement was that there would be a political negotiation, that the head of Ukraine would go meet with the head of these breakaway republics, and there would be a level of autonomy that they would get within the nation of Ukraine, and that would be negotiated. And you know, Zelensky, when he was in the electoral campaign for president, he promised that he would implement those Minsk Accords, that he would go meet with the leaders of the breakaway republics, that he would be a peace president. And that's one of the reasons that he gained so much popularity, and he won with an overwhelming vote. And yet when he came in, he realized that it was very difficult to do, because there were these nationalist elements that said, no way, we want every inch of Ukraine back in our hands, and we will not allow you to meet with the leaders and implement those political aspects of the Minsk Accords. In fact, they threatened to hang him from the tree if he indeed did that. And what we've learned very recently, in fact, just in the last couple of weeks, from an interview that Angela Merkel from Germany gave in a German paper, and another interview that the former head of France, Francois Hollande, who was in power at that time, they both said something similar. They said the Minsk agreements were really a time to buy time for Ukraine and to allow the West to send in weapons, to build up the army in Ukraine, to be better able to fight both the Donbass and potentially a war with Russia. And so Putin has come out and said, how are we going to negotiate an agreement if this agreement that we had in 2015 was never meant to be implemented? It was really meant to buy time. And so let's fast forward to where we are today. We have Zelensky and Putin at one point after the after the Russian invasion in February, sitting down, not them, but their representatives, at the table with the head of Turkey, Erdogan, being the mediator. And, you know, we give examples in our book where it's much easier to negotiate a peaceful solution to a conflict early on, like in the first month of the conflict. And so it was a very hopeful sign that they were meeting. And many people thought that there was going to be an agreement because they came out with a 15-point plan. And key elements of that plan was that the Russian troops would leave and that Ukraine would give up its hopes of joining NATO and would agree to be a neutral country. That there would be some kind of supervised elections in the Donbass, and that the issue of Crimea would be put off, perhaps for as long as 15 years. And so there were positive signs. In fact, Zelensky went on national television to talk to the people of Ukraine and say that it was his desire to bring about peace, that whatever agreement they came to would be put to the Ukrainian people for a vote. And while this was happening, the head of the UK at that time, Boris Johnson, came to meet with Zelensky. And lo and behold, he said to Zelensky, we don't want you to negotiate an agreement. The collective West is with you in this fight, and you should fight to victory. And then we had Lloyd Austin from the US Secretary of Defense meeting with Zelensky as well, and saying that in this fight, we had to weaken Russia. And after those meetings, the peace talks dissolved. So they were hijacked by the UK and the US. And this narrative became one that if we keep giving enough weapons to Ukraine, they can win. And we saw some pretty spectacular gains by the Ukrainians early on, and that fed into this narrative that they could push back the Russians. And we see that in the US government and in Congress, they were certainly saying that we have to support Ukraine to victory. And victory was not clear what it meant, because in some cases, victory meant push the Russians back to where they were when they invaded on February 24th. But to others, it meant victory is push the Russians back to where it was in 2014. Get them out of the Donbass totally and out of Crimea. Well, when you hear from people in the military, a lot of them said that it's very unrealistic to think that you could get back to 2014. And yet here we have Zelensky now who is saying that's exactly what we want. And as I started out saying, we have now reports in the New York Times saying that the US government is now thinking favorably about the idea of helping them to attack Crimea. You might have heard the comments of Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is the #1 military advisor to Biden. And he came out and he said the Ukrainians have done this tremendous job resisting the Russian invasion, but it doesn't look like there will be a victory on the battlefield. They should seize this moment now and go to the negotiating table. Now, it was pretty remarkable to hear him say that publicly and not lose his job.
Yeah.
And he didn't lose his job, although now he's walking that back. In fact, he was just meeting with Zelensky in Poland because I'm sure he has gotten a lot of pressure from others inside the Biden administration as well. And things are so topsy-turvy in our country that you would think that the State Department, which is the diplomatic arm of our government, headed by Anthony Blinken, would be the one calling for negotiations. And maybe people in the military would say, you know, let's just keep sending in the weapons. It's the other way around. You find Anthony Blinken going around the Western countries trying to gin up more weapons to send to Ukraine. And yet you get these pronouncements by people like Mark Milley saying, go to the negotiating table. Now, when it comes to Biden himself, Biden has not met with Putin this whole time. And I don't know about you, but I feel that it's the height of his irresponsibility for him not to meet with Putin. Because you can say all you want, you can't negotiate with Putin, you can't negotiate with Putin, but if you don't try, you certainly can't negotiate. And I think it's a simple answer to say, try. Let's see. If it fails, then you can tell the whole world what was being proposed and why it failed. But if you don't try, all we know is that we are refusing to talk to the Russians, and we are refusing to push the Ukrainians to talk to the Russians. Now, some people say, and the U.S. hides behind this idea of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. We can't possibly push Zelensky. But you know what? The constant giving of weapons and all the money is a disincentive to sit down and talk. So, the Congress in our country, you would think, would be a body that could have some real discussions about this issue. They're supposed to represent us. Now let's recognize that there is this media narrative that says, you know, let's support Ukraine to victory, you can't negotiate with Russia and all that kind of thing. But despite that, every poll that has come out shows that as the months go by, more and more Americans are in favor of negotiations. And some of those polls actually show that a majority of Americans are in favor of negotiations. So you'd think there'd be a significant number of people in our Congress who would recognize that and take that position. And unfortunately, somebody like me left my phone on. Thank you. So unfortunately, what we have seen is very, very, very few people in Congress questioning the blank check. And when there was the $40 billion that was voted on for Ukraine, $19 billion of it for weapons, there was not one Democrat in the entire Congress that voted against that. What happened to Barbara Lee, who was the great peace vote during the days after 9/11, when it went around the whole country, there was one woman with that prophetic vote that said, let us not take this as a reason to go to war and create more violence. And I remember those buttons that said, Barbara Lee speaks for me, and they were all over the country. And she, of course, was right. This time around, she voted for the $40 billion package. What about the Squad? Squad is supposed to be so progressive. Wouldn't anybody in the Squad stand up and say, I think we better have a full debate about this issue before we go in to vote for something as huge as $40 billion for this war? Not one of them. In the Republican Party, there were 57 members of the House who voted against it, and 11 in the Senate. Some of them had very good reasons. They said, because I've been hearing from my constituents, and they want me to vote against it, and they're saying that there are important domestic needs that are unmet that we should consider. Some of them said things that I don't agree with, and were things like, well, our real enemy is China, not Russia. Or they'd say we should be spending that money to fortify our border against the hordes that are trying to invade our country from Mexico, or things like that. But the fact is that there was some dissent within the Republican Party. Of course, a lot of that might also be because there's a Democrat in the White House. And this is all party politics. And if it were Trump in the White House, I think we would have Barbara Lee in the Squad saying, let's question this before we vote for this. So it's very unfortunate that these party politics are played out at a time when there is such a life and death struggle as this war. But we see now, so there has been some pressure from the base on some of the Democrats. And then there was the head of the Progressive Caucus in the Democratic Party, Pramila Jayapal, who's from Seattle. And she was getting a lot of pressure from progressives to initiate a letter that would call for negotiations. Now, a lot of us wanted that letter to not even bring up the issue of weapons, because we didn't want to have that argument. We just wanted them to say, okay, let's go for negotiations. The letter was even, I would say, more military or more hawkish than many of us wanted, because it said, thank you, President Biden, for all the military support and the economic support that you have given to Ukraine and we in Congress have voted for. But in addition to that, it would be good if we would push for negotiations. So an extremely mild letter. Now, there are 100 members of the Progressive Caucus, and naive people like myself, when I read the letter, I said, oh, every single member of that Progressive Caucus is going to sign that. And then once we get all of them, then we'll start going for the more moderate members who are not in the Progressive Caucus. And I thought we'd get, like 200 members of the Democratic Party. I knew we wouldn't get Republicans because of the way it was worded. They started out thanking President Biden. So right off there, you know it's not a bipartisan letter. So anyway, they put out the letter, and lo and behold, it was really, really hard to get anybody to sign on. And after 2 weeks, which is the usual time a letter's out there and then you close it, they only had 5 members of Congress on. And so they kept extending it and extending it and extending it. And we kept, in the movement against the war, kept saying to people, put pressure on your congressperson. They got to sign the letter. They got to sign the letter. After a long time, I think it was September, October, they finally got 30 members of Congress to sign that letter. And then they thought, okay, that's about as much as we're going to get. We better get this letter out. Well, lo and behold, they got the letter out very close to election time. And that was a big mistake, because timing is important. And they got it out, and all hell broke loose, because people in the Democratic Party said, what the heck are you doing? There are elections coming up. we're looking like we're a divided party on this issue of national security. That's so important. Why in the world would you sign a letter like that and put it out now? And so individuals start saying, take my name off that letter. I signed it months ago when it was a different circumstance. And lo and behold, after less than 24 hours, something happened that I've never seen in all my time in Washington, which is that a letter that was signed, sealed, and already delivered to Biden was then withdrawn. And there was only one member of Congress in all of the 30 who signed that, who kept the position that yes, the letter made sense. Yes, we should move for negotiations. And that was Congressman Ro Khanna from California. He went on CNN and he said, it's an absolutely rational position. And he got a lot of support for saying that from people all over the country. I went to his office to thank him, and his chief of staff said, we've been getting so many positive responses. And, you know, I thought, okay, well, that will then encourage others to go back. But no, it's like they got burned from that letter, and they don't want to talk about this issue. And meanwhile, since then, they voted over and over again for more and more money to send to Ukraine. So this brings up, and I want in some time in the discussion to talk about how are we going to move them, not just those 30, but how are we going to move Congress in general to this position. And one of the things that we hear from some progressive members of Congress, and I might as well name one of them, and that is Bernie Sanders, is, you know, something I have a hard time believing. When that letter was being circulated, we thought, oh, we need a similar letter in the Senate side. And so we went to his office and said it's most logical that this would be initiated by Bernie Sanders. And what did we hear from his top staff on foreign policy? They said, Medea, you are tone deaf. And at first I thought tone deaf because they would like a letter that was even more progressive than the one that came out from the House side. And instead it was, you're tone deaf because you can't talk to Putin. You can't call for negotiations. And I was kind of feeling it was surreal to be sitting in Bernie Sanders' office and hearing that. I mean, who do you talk to? You talk to your adversaries. You talk to the people who you think are the horrible people. That's the people you need to negotiate with. And when people continue to say, you can't talk to Putin, I did say that we should say try, but there are other examples that we can give. We can say, well, you talked to Putin to get Brittany Griner out of prison, and that seemed to have worked. When it was in the U.S. interest to really push for that, they did it, and it worked. And then there have been talks between Ukraine and Russia, separate from what I mentioned in the beginning of the war when they were really negotiating about the big issues. There have been negotiations about specific but very important things, and they've been successful. So you probably had no idea before this war began how important Ukraine and Russia were in terms of exports of grain and fertilizer. Right. How much of the world depended on the grain and fertilizer coming from those two countries. And so when the war began, it was hard for Russia to get its fertilizers out because of things like sanctions. And it was hard for Ukraine to get the grain out of the country. And so there was pressure from the global community, from the United Nations, and they got together and negotiated a grain deal to be able to create the land corridor and the sea corridor to get millions of tons of grains out of Ukraine and get the fertilizers out of Russia. There's another example. And that was at a time when it was really scary because it looked like that Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, the largest nuclear plant in Europe, was going to just blow up. and there were accusations of shelling from both sides, and there probably was shelling from both sides. And lo and behold, international pressure, again, the United Nations playing a very good role, and they came together and agreed that there would be representatives from the International Atomic Energy Association would come in and would calm down the situation in that plant. And that happened. And I mentioned the prisoner swap between the US and Russia, but what you don't hear about is the prisoner swaps that are happening all the time between Ukraine and Russia. And I find that quite remarkable, because you're in the middle of a war, you hate each other, you're killing each other, and yet you're talking on a regular basis about how many people from your side, how many people from our side, how's it going to happen, what are the logistics, how are we going to trust that you're actually going to give us the 100 people that you said you were, and those are happening every single month. Again, something that we don't hear about, but is happening. So talks are possible. They're always possible to talk. And I think we're in the position now of how do we build up that momentum. I would think that if we can come together with our friends in Europe and put more pressure on our governments to put pressure on Ukraine, and then get the friends of Russia, like China and other countries in the global south, to put the pressure on Russia, we could be successful in getting them to the negotiating table. Western Europe is really hurting from this war. The US and the West thought they were so clever with the sanctions that they already had devised before the war began, that they were going to implement right away. The ruble was going to crash, the Russian economy was going to crumble, and Putin would have to give in. Well, the opposite really happened, which that the ruble did not crash, the price of oil went way up, and so the Russians were selling more, but less, but making more money. And the sanctions, again, that Europe imposed trying not to buy energy from Russia meant that the price of energy in Europe went way up. In fact, who wanted to come in and fill that void from the energy from Russia? US companies. And I was recently in Texas talking to the people who fight big oil in Texas and how it's destroyed so many of their communities. And they said as soon as the war broke out in Ukraine, all the work that we were doing came to naught because they gave new licenses for production of both LNG and oil. And they said this is because we have to help our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. And the Europeans are saying they're selling the oil to Europe now at 4 or 5 times the prices that they're selling it here in the United States, that there is war profiteering going on by US companies taking advantage of the sanctions on Russian energy. And so the Europeans, even though their governments for the most part are continuing to work with the United States and sending more weapons into Ukraine, there are more and more European people that are standing up and saying the cost to us is too high, you have to find a solution. And there are large demonstrations that are happening in Germany, especially East Germany, in the Czech Republic, in France, in Italy, and in my organization, we are Code Pink, part of a coalition called Peace in Ukraine. We're working with the Europeans. They've created a collective group called Peace in Europe in trying to build together a global appeal for peace in Ukraine. And also working with groups in the Global South, because in the Global South, they too are impacted by this war. The price of the groceries has gone up, the price of energy has gone up, and there are also tremendous complaints by a lot of the countries in the global south that have been so impacted by the climate crisis, like Pakistan, that in their last floods had a third of their country underwater, or these small island nations whose very existence is in jeopardy. And they are saying, this war is taking the attention away from where it needs to be, which is on the climate crisis. And they're also saying that this war is taking the resources away from where it should be. That you in the wealthier countries that are causing the climate crisis have promised year after year that you're going to have this global climate fund and you're going to put in at least $100 billion into that fund, have never done that. And yet, in less than a year, you've given way over $100 billion to Ukraine. Where are your priorities? And so while we might feel very lonely in this country at this time, we are really part of a much larger global community. And when there was the UN Security Council meeting last time, there were countries that got up there and said pretty much this. They said, we do not want to be forced to take sides in what we see as a proxy war between Russia and the United States. We only see one side in this we want to take, and that is the side of peace. And we want you all to figure out how to solve this problem because it is affecting all of us. So getting back to what we can do, we are in a very odd position when we don't have our progressives in Congress that we can look to be our voices. And yet, the most rational voices on this issue in Congress are coming from the most irrational members of Congress, like Marjorie Taylor Greene. Marjorie Taylor Greene has said a lot of crazy things, taken a lot of terrible positions, but she is saying very rational things about this war. She is saying that there are needs in the United States that have to be met. She is saying that let's audit where all of these the money and all of these weapons are going. And we have people like, have you heard of this Arizona Congressman Paul Kozar? He is one of the also very kooky members of Congress. He had been sanctioned at one time by both parties and taken off all committees because he had these animated cartoons of himself killing AOC and trying to kill Biden as well. And yet he has put out a letter saying he's inviting Zelensky and Putin to come to Arizona for peace talks that he will mediate. And there's somebody else with views that have at times been quite strange, and that is Donald Trump, who has put himself forward. And he has been going to rallies, and when he announced that he was going to be running for president, he always brings up this issue of Ukraine. And he says, look, you get the Democrats in power, and what do you get? War. If I was in power, I would end this war because I would talk to Putin. And he says that because he knows it's a popular position. So it is very important that we lift up other voices. And one of those voices that we have worked with, Ethan here, who some of you might know, do you want to just say hello?
I'm with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, so we work closely with Medea and the clothing community. We're actually really fortunate. We're an interfaith peace and justice organization that was founded at the start of World War I, working on issues of rights of conscience and resistance to war, social change. And we're really blessed as our new director, our first Jewish executive director, who is a colleague, longtime colleague of Medea's, worked with Medea for many years, Ariel Gold. So some of you know me work with Ariel, some of Medea and their team for many years around a number of issues, particularly Palestine solidarity.
So I'll just, for the recording, just say that we have been working with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the National Council of Elders on this campaign during the holiday season to get members of the faith-based community to call for a Christmas truce. And I remember when Ariel Gold was at my house in Washington, D.C., and we came up with this idea. We said, let's have a goal of getting 100 faith-based leaders. And in about 2 weeks or 3 or then 4 weeks, we had over 1,500 faith-based leaders who signed on to that call. And they included people like Reverend Barber of the Poor People's Campaign that works a lot in your state, included people like Jesse Jackson, included people from all different faith communities. And it was so exciting to see how that took off and how people wanted to get their name on there, wanted to be on record. And that's a very important voice for us to have, because now we don't have to say that we're in line with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now we can say we're in line with 1,500 faith-based leaders in the United States. And we want to build on that as we go forward. There are other communities that we are working with now to join in with us, and one of those is the environmental community. The environmental community is so much more organized and has so many more followers, especially among young people, than the anti-war community has. And we need that kind of energy. And so we're working with some of these organizations to make sure that they understand how intertwined these issues are on so many levels. When the Russians invaded, 200 of those organizations came out with a stand that I was very concerned about. They came out with this declaration calling Stand with Ukraine. And they said that they wanted to join in the boycotting of Russian energy. You even had Greenpeace ships going out into the sea to try to stop Russian ships full of Russian oil. And they said that this was their stand with Ukraine, and that it was also a moment to quickly speed up the transition from dirty energy to clean energy. And I met with a number of them, and I said, well, I find this a little odd. One, you never said boycott Saudi energy in these 8 years that they have been devastating the people of Yemen. And I never heard you say boycott U.S. energy when we went into Iraq and committed all kinds of crimes there. Why all of a sudden Russia? But even so, I thought that they were short-sighted not to see what would really happen, which is the U.S. and other dirty energy companies getting in and saying, aha, now we have to expand our production. And you might have been seeing the protests that have been happening in Germany about the coal plant that they want to build, and Greta Thunberg getting detained there and addressing the crowds, and this is an example of how they use Ukraine as a justification to say, well, now that we don't have that oil from Russia, we have to have coal pits, and we have to have nuclear plants that were supposed to be decommissioned are not going to be decommissioned now. And so the environmental community needs to understand that this is an open season for dirty energy to use this conflict as a justification for increasing production. But there are all sorts of other reasons why this is should be so important to the environmental community. The blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline released the largest methane gas emissions that we have ever recorded. Of course, we might go into who actually blew it up. But there's also the issue of the destruction of the environment that just happens from war, the destruction that happens from the production of all of these weapons. And then, as I said earlier, the money and the energy that's going into this war instead of going into solving the climate crisis. So I think we really need to bring on board a lot of these big groups, whether it's Greenpeace, Sierra Club, 350.org, Sunrise Movement, all of these groups should be really standing up with us and going into the halls of Congress with us to demand negotiations and an end to this war. And so finally, I just want to put this in the context. While this war is a very difficult one because of Russia's involvement in it, and it's not like Iraq, where it was the U.S. direct involvement, where we could see what our government was doing to create this conflict, and where we have a lot of good people among our friends, our relatives, all kinds of people who really feel for the Ukrainian people, see what they are suffering, the kind of death and destruction, the millions of people who have had to flee their homes, the people in the middle of winter who are living now without electricity, without energy supplies. And our hearts go out to them. And they feel that the way to support them is giving more weapons. I think we have to just talk to these people in a very loving way to make them recognize that there is no military victory, that war is not the answer, and that it is our responsibility to find ways to heal this earth, and that to recognize that our government has constantly been using military responses to conflicts. This is certainly not the first time. And that when our government says that we're in this to support democracy, we can say, how come we support Saudi Arabia? How come we support Israel? How come we support Egypt? And on of all the very repressive governments that the U.S. supports. And when we say that the United States is the force of good, we have to point out that we just passed a Pentagon budget of $858 billion, not counting other money for Veterans Affairs, for nuclear weapons, the money for Ukraine. You put that all together, we're $1 trillion that we're spending a year on the military. And meanwhile, as I travel around this country and see in cities after city, people sleeping in doorways, people making tent cities. You see here, thanking this church for these tiny houses that are here, but how many people don't have access to a roof over their head? How many young people continue to be in tremendous debt just for wanting to get an education to contribute to our society? How many of us can't find decent health care because our healthcare system is for profit and it is so broken. And so we have to look at this in this context, that as long as we continue to have this massive military system, that we will never be able to address these critical issues that our people need and the planet really needs. And we see our government looking towards China and saying, China is this adversary, China is, our enemy, we've got to build up our forces to be able to confront China. And yet we see China, well, it does things wrong, I'm not saying it doesn't. It goes around the world building things, creating infrastructure. Some of them maybe not so good for the environment, but some of them very good and for the people, and it's a win-win kind of situation, and they're not sending in their military. And so why don't we learn from why the Chinese are making so many friends around the world when we are not doing that? And it really is part of a much larger issue that somebody like Martin Luther King told us about many, many decades ago and rings true today when he said a country that puts more and more of its resources into militarism instead of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And he also said something that I'd like to end on, which he said that those of us who love peace must learn to organize more effectively than those who are in favor of war. And that is certainly our job. Thank you so much. So let's go into the discussion part, see who would like to lead us off. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, now I have your knowledge and experience and commitment, you know, to what's going on around the world, especially in Ukraine. I just have a couple little burrs in my saddle about, because you know, it's a conundrum. You got to admit. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
all different issues coming together. The first one had, you know, I'm looking forward to reading your book, and I'm hoping I can get a better understanding of this, like NATO creeping east. And I sort of have a gut feeling, and I don't have, you know, research on this, but if I was in Poland, if I was a citizen of Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union collapsed, where would I want to go to? I mean, as screwed up as we are and evil and all that good stuff, I would choose the West over Putin. And that's my second point. And I hate to sound like the media, but, you know, I mean, I think he's a major psychopath. And I'll put him in class with George W. Bush, so I'm here. Seriously, I mean that. I mean, he did it to Iraq, and only because they're dark people, we don't go, oh, that poor baby got killed by... Anyway, and so I think it's like, my biggest concern is like, this is the guy that leveled the capital of, it just went on, Grozny is, you know, in Chechnya. I mean, he did, we don't know what he did there. I mean, it was horrible. And you got, you know, he struts around like, I don't know, I'm trying not to lose my faith in humanity here, but I mean, with somebody like him, you know, it seems very difficult to, I agree strongly we should try, there's no doubt about that. I don't think it's going to work, and I hate to say that, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, there are some analysts who say that Russia is winning, and there are others who say Russia has already lost. That given that Russia came in from 3 sides of Ukraine going towards Kyiv, they seems obvious to many of us that they thought that they could take over the whole country, and that didn't happen. And then there were some gains that the Ukrainians made, but now it's pretty much a stalemate. You hear Biden himself say that Putin needs an off-ramp. And there are others who say Putin needs an off-ramp, that he miscalculated, that he had bad intelligence perhaps, who knows, or he didn't listen to the people who had the intelligence, but that this was a tremendous mistake that he made. And now his reputation is on the line. And as you kind of alluded to, he's not about to just say, I made a mistake, I'm going to turn around and go home. That he is being pushed and pushed into a corner. And that's where I think this Crimea issue is so dangerous. Because they have nuclear weapons. And there are people who say he's a maniac, he's this, he's that, but he's not going to use nuclear weapons. And I think we should say, what makes you so sure about that? And even in this New York Times article, it said, well, he will probably retaliate very strongly if we go ahead and help the Ukrainians attack Crimea. Well, I think if pushed, he would use a nuclear weapon. I mean, why wouldn't he? If he's so desperate and doesn't want to lose his power, it's a terrible situation that somebody has that kind of power. But that's the situation we're in. And it does remind me of the 1962 missile crisis. And when you see that these 2 people, Khrushchev and JFK, had the future of the world in their hands, and at least they were smart enough to recognize after 13 really horrible days that they better negotiate, and they came up with a compromise. And the compromise, you know, the Russians taking the missiles out of Cuba, it's so fascinating. The American people were never told the compromise that we would take our missiles out of Turkey. because they didn't want Congress to know that, because they would have said no. And it was only years later that we learned that that was the compromise that was made. But I think there's something so important that JFK said a year later when he was doing a public address. He said, when you're in a confrontation with a nuclear power, never put them in a position where their option is between a humiliating defeat or the use of a nuclear weapon. And that's exactly where we're putting Putin. So you can hate Putin as much as you want, you can think he's a crazy, maniacal, whatever, but let's look at the reality on the ground. Do we want to push him into a corner, or do we want to give him an off-ramp? And I think that, you know, Biden is irresponsible because he said, not in any public forum of a policy kind of thing, in a fundraiser, he actually talked about nuclear Armageddon. And he talked about needing this off-ramp. And so I think it's beholden on him, who's somebody who understands that Putin is not about to cry uncle, to give him a way out of a humiliating retreat. And I think the U.S. can do that in some talks where the U.S. might say that we will not build the base in Poland that's 100 miles from your border, that we will renegotiate the idea of having 5 countries in Europe have U.S. nuclear missiles, that we will go back to some of the arms treaties that we had that we pulled out of. There are a lot of things that the U.S. could do that would be face-saving for Putin. So.
First of all, as far as I'm concerned, the United States had no business getting involved in Ukraine in the first place.
I can repeat what he says. Okay.
Give him the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
Okay.
And I'll repeat for the recording.
First of all, I'm so disappointed that the United States ever got involved in the Ukraine problem in the first place. It seems like our country cannot resist any war that they have a chance to fight in. And no war is good. You know, they're all bad. But something else I wanted to bring up is that there was a videographer, Regis Tremblay, and he's a member of Veterans for Peace, and he took his camera over to Crimea soon after Crimea became part of Russia, and he interviewed people in Crimea and asked them, how did this whole thing evolve? You know, what happened here? And they said, we didn't want to be a part of the new Ukraine. You know, the new regime in Ukraine was not acceptable to us, and so we wanted to become a part of Russia instead. So we went to Putin and asked him if we couldn't become a part of Ukraine. He said, take a referendum, and if you get enough signatures, you can hold a vote. If the people want to vote on it, then you can hold a vote, and we will be amenable to whatever the people of Crimea say. Well, they had a vote. There was something on the order of 95% participation in the election, and there was 95% voted for unity with Russia, and so it became a part of Russia. This is not the narrative I've ever heard anywhere else. And I just wonder why Regis Tremblay got, and I saw the video, I saw these people in Ukraine that's telling this story, but I've never heard that story anywhere else.
Well, that referendum was not seen as internationally acceptable because they said it was under occupation. I always question when there's a vote and there's 95% in favor. You gotta wonder about it. Which is why when they were talking about these peace talks, they said, well, let's put off this issue of Ukraine because of Crimea, because there wasn't fighting going on in Crimea. People were living peacefully. It was quite a prosperous place. And they said, let's put that off, and maybe at some point there will be internationally supervised referenda that the whole world can accept. But I think the important point there is to say that it's majority Russian, ethnic Russian, Russian-speaking, and that it had been part of Russia for more time than it had ever been part of Ukraine, and that there are a lot of people in Crimea who do want to be part of Russia. This also goes back to something you said about Putin that I should have mentioned, which is, well, when the Soviet Union fell apart, there was such a disruption of the Soviet economy with the privatization, with the disaster capitalism, with the corruption, with the oligarchs, with the tremendous slide down of the standard of living of the Russian people, losing 7 years in their life expectancy. When Putin came in, he really built the economy back up. And that's why he had, before this invasion, popularity rates in the opinion polls, even ones done by US companies, that were like 76%. And they've gone down somewhat in this war, but he does have a lot of popular support internally. And I think it is good to bring up that there are other sources of information that people could look at, and maybe we should just take a moment here where people can shout out some of the sources of information. And I think it's really important that we be very skeptical about every source of information at this point, but know that we have to have a variety of them. So people want to say Democracy Now! Is one of them. The Duran.
Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera.
Counterpunch.
Counterpunch.
Fair.org.
Fair.org.
Sheer Post.
Sheer Post.
SCHEER Post.
Right.
The New Atlas.
The New Atlas.
Consortium News.
Consortium News.
Useful Idiots.
Youthful Idiots, a podcast. Chris Hedges.
Caitlin Johnstone on the Consortium News.
Caitlin Johnstone on Consortium
Robert
News.
Johnson.
What?
Robert Johnson.
Robert Johnson.
Richard Wolf.
Richard Wolf.
Chris Hedges.
Chris Hedges. We better say David Barsamian.
Yeah, alternative radio.
Alternative radio.
Chomsky.
Chomsky, no Chomsky.
Grey Zone.
Gray Zone.
Yeah.
Vijay Prashad.
Multipolarista.
Multipolarista. And I think I would say these in addition to other more mainstream sources, because it's important to hear. When I'm home, I turn on Fox News and my partner says, I turn that off. But I think it's important to hear what they're saying. Just as I think it's important to hear what CNN is saying, what MSNBC is saying, get a little taste of a lot of different viewpoints.
So how can we use, how can we use this perspective and desire for peace and go across the aisle? How can we use the crazies or join with the crazies? Maybe we are the crazies, but how do we use that in order to advance peace?
So this is a question about how do we go across the aisle, meet with some of these extreme right-wing people, and have some kind of joint efforts for the goal of achieving a call for negotiations and a ceasefire. And that's a really contentious issue. There are a lot of people who would consider themselves progressives who say, I do not want to work with anybody who is virulently anti-immigrant, who has said and done very racist things, who has been anti-women, women's choice, or who has been anti-gay rights. There's a lot of people who say, this is a red line for me and I won't cross it, or will maybe just say the race issue. If they're really racist, I don't want to work with them. And there are others who say, we in the progressive movement have been unable to build up much of a movement ourselves, so we better reach out to anybody at this point, and especially knowing with the Democrat in the White House how hard it is to get Democrats, we better reach out to anybody. And I think there are legitimate issues on both sides of that. There is a protest that's being called for February 19th in Washington, D.C. that's being called by two groups. One is the Libertarian Party, and one is called the People's Party. The Libertarian Party has people with all kinds of positions in it, and there are people within the Libertarian Party who are part of a caucus who have some views or connections that are not the most progressive, let's say, and some of us have decided that we want to be part of that because we want to see more people coming out and more pressure being put. So for example, I'm going to be speaking at that February 19th event, but the organization that I'm most affiliated with, Code Pink, refuses to endorse that event. So, you get that kind of conflict, and it's natural, understandable, but I think as we move forward, maybe we'll be able to be mobilizing more people that we're comfortable with. And that's why I think this reaching out to the Quakers, to the Mennonites, to all of these faith-based groups is an important outreach to the environmental groups, to a lot of the youth organizations, like we were just in an event where we had the people who are working on the student debt issue to come in with us to join and talk about how we can better use our resources. So I think, both of those efforts are going on at the same time, and we'll see where they move. I've asked the people in Europe how it's going, because I've seen that some of the demonstrations they've had are left and right coming together. And in some countries, they feel comfortable doing that. In other countries, they said, no, we are calling either the left or right will call the demonstration, and then others are welcome to come to it, and they can come with their signs. Like you could go to a demonstration that the libertarians are organizing, and you could have the sign, "Peace in Ukraine, immigrants welcome," or whatever other issue you wanted to highlight. And so you were there very clearly that you were with them on one issue but not on the other issue. The advantage in Europe that I see that we don't have here is that in many countries they have the support of the trade unions, or some trade unions. And so their demonstrations are financed by the trade unions. They bring in the workers that are part of those trade unions, and they have a history of working together as progressive with the trade unions. Here in the United States, since the time of the Iraq War, there's been a group called U.S. Labor Against the War. But they had a very difficult time. They get in some trade unions, but they'd mostly be smaller ones, or they'd be locals instead of the nationals. And, here, so many workers are part of the war machine. And you have these big unions like the machinists that make a lot of money from the Pentagon contracts. And we should be able to get the teachers union, the nurses union, and that is another area where we should work very hard, is to bring in some of the unions, and if we can't get the nationals, to get the locals. So maybe we can have a couple more.
Don't you think social change comes about lots of times from the people on the fringes rather than in the middle? So if leftists and people on the right join in this one issue, I think that can be positive.
Yeah, Ralph Nader wrote a whole book about this, and he had held a conference, and brought people from the left and the right together, and brought up issues that we agreed on. For example, that the Pentagon should be audited and should be able to pass an audit if they want our money. Another one was issues around term limits that many of us think is a good idea. And so he outlined that, he brought the people at the conference together, and so when this issue came up, and it's such a dilemma, the co-founder of Code Pink, I asked her to give Ralph a call and talk to him about this. and set up a meeting. And she said, he talked so much that I couldn't set up the meeting, but he just wanted to talk about it. But basically, what he said, I think, because this is only secondhand from her, is that it's very hard with this crop of people in the right, in the extreme right. That they're not reliable, they're not serious about issues. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene was, until recently, a supporter of QAnon. You know, Marjorie Taylor Greene talked about what Hillary Clinton and the Pizzagate and the babies and the pedophilians, Jewish lasers. You know, Ralph was more thinking of more rational